outside of a conflict, if they just didn't need U.S. increased support, we have taught them with the affirmative ballot that they can just simply rely on the government, rely on the United States. They don't actually have to meet U.S. values in order to get U.S. support. That's the argument here, is that under the affirmative plan, you teach the Philippines under the affirmative plan that they don't have to actually conform to human rights. They don't have to conform to the standards of the United States. All they have to do is ask for our help, and we will give it to them blindly, without actually considering the situation. That's not a policy we want to propose. That's not a policy we want our allies to be considering, that they can simply rely on the United States without actually being willing to support our values and support our human rights. Let's turn to disadvantage 3. Disadvantage 3 is human rights abuses. Human rights abuses. Under the affirmative plan, human rights abuses would go up. Let's first read a piece of evidence about how bad the situation really is in the Philippines. Thomas Wan, a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service, said in April 2012, quote, of more than 1,000 extrajudicial killings and murders of journalists reported since 2001, according to one report, there have been only 7 successfully prosecuted cases, unquote. 1,000 extrajudicial killings and murders of journalists, only 7 cases have been correctly prosecuted. Now, under the affirmative plan, the situation in the Philippines, the human rights would only get worse. Why? Because under the affirmative plan, there's no pressure on the Philippines to improve their situation. The affirmative plan is a counterproductive policy. The counter plan is proven empirically. Thank you. Anyone for any questions the affirmative speaker may have? David Baker.
Awesome, thank you. Let's start off with the solvency piece of evidence you read, stating that we're currently giving the planes and etc. to the Philippines.
That's
Sure. Can I take a look at it?
It's in the yeah.
Sure. I understand it's in the 1AC. Does the piece of evidence name a time frame for when that's set to be?
It says current plans, so
okay,
it doesn't name a specific.
When would they be there? Would you agree the piece of evidence says they'll be estimated to be there by 2016?
Let me take a look. 2013. Actually, it says in 2012 or 2013, Philippines expects to buy the first round from the United States.
Okay, sure. We'll be talking about that.
And this is 2013.
Sure. Yes, it is. Yeah. You're right. Okay, let's move to their third disadvantage. Your third disadvantage. Actually, it's kind of like your second disadvantage. So we'll talk about the second disadvantage. Your second disadvantage was that the Philippines will be increasing dependence upon the United States. Do you believe that the Philippines should be able to receive a credible defense? The Philippines has the right to have a credible defense.
In some ways, I believe that Philippines should be taught that they can't just rely 100% on the United States to give them that credible defense without actually supporting the United States values.
Okay, sure. And then your third disadvantage, which was a little bit different, I guess, talked about human rights abuses. You said if we set this precedent, the Philippines is going to ignore their human rights abuses. Correct?
Well, that the affirmative plan puts no pressure on the Philippines and just teaches the Philippines that they can get all the U.S. support they want without actually improving on and trying to secure human rights and United States values.
Okay, let's kind of combine your two arguments about China, first with the trade being hurt and your relations disadvantage. You said that China isn't going to do anything, basically you said China isn't going to do anything to upset the United States, but then our plan is going to make China mad.
Yes, your plan takes the first step in increasing tensions with China.
Okay, is there tensions between the Philippines and China right now?
There are some tensions, yes. Not enough to cause a conflict, but there are some.
Sure, absolutely. And you believe giving the Philippines 25 airplanes would cause conflict?
Well, you claim with your plan that 25 airplanes is enough to revolutionize and so supposedly change their whole military standpoint. So if your plan is significant, then the disadvantage is significant.
We claim it's a credible defense, but my partner can be talking about that.
All right.
So you talked about how there's really no chance of a military conflict right now.
In the current system.
Okay, current system. But it's the negative chance belief that giving them 25 airplanes would cause conflict, increased conflict between China and the Philippines.
It's the negative team's belief that the more we try and get involved in this situation in terms of trying to increase our military aid to them without standing for U.S. values, the more that your plan does, that actually the more we increase tensions with China.
Okay, awesome. Thanks very much.
Already negative?
Jake, can I get the 1AC back?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Did I take it? Whoops.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry.
All the judges already? And the time? Affirmative team?
Yep.
The United States needs to stand up for the people in the Philippines. We need to decrease the human rights abuses that are going throughout the country. And the only way to do that is through the negative team's counterplan. In this speech, we're going to be going over the responses to the counterplan, the disadvantages that they brought up, and then looking at the inherency of the current plan, the responses to the mandates. First off, let's start off with the counterplan, whether or not it is actually legitimate in the round. They're saying that it is not mutually exclusive to the Affirmative plan, that both of the plans can happen at the same time. My first response is of a misunderstanding. That the Affirmative team believes that our counterplan is to condition all of the military aid that we currently have with the Philippines. That is simply a misunderstanding. What we do is we condition giving the fighter jets upon and improving their human rights. So it is completely different than the Affirmative team's plan. My second response is that it is impossible. It is impossible. It is absolutely impossible to condition the fighter jets upon them improving, but also give them the fighter jets immediately. It is completely impossible to do both at the same time. Let's move down to his disadvantage against our case, which was of security in the Philippines decreasing. He was saying that given they're going to have all of this, going to need to have all their money spent on improving the human rights, we won't be able to fight terrorism. I have one response. My response is not a problem. Not a problem. The Affirmative team didn't bring up any evidence saying that terrorism is actually a problem in the Philippines. We have no proof about whether or not they're actually going to have to fight terrorism. Now, if terrorism in the Philippines isn't actually a problem, the Philippines don't have to fight it, meaning they don't have to spend all of their money doing this. So they will have the money to decrease the human rights abuses, and they won't go bankrupt and go into an economic downturn or anything like that, because there's no proof that they actually have to fight any terrorism. But I'm going to talk about the counterplan a little more, and I'm going to be talking about what the Affirmative team didn't do in their last speech. Specifically, they didn't give a reason why our plan wouldn't work. They brought up a disadvantage against our case, but they didn't give any logic or analysis as to why our specific plan would not work. The Affirmative team did bring up logic and analysis. Firstly, we said that the military aid doesn't solve for human rights abuses, but that it actually weakens the resolve of that country to reform themselves, meaning that the Affirmative's plan is actually going to weaken the resolve of the Philippines to decrease the human rights abuses. That specifically was not responded to by the Affirmative team. The other logic that the negative team has is that the United States pressure in the past with the Philippines has created reform in that country. That point also was not responded to by the Affirmative team. So the negative team has 2 points of logic with the counter plan, and the Affirmative team didn't bring up any logic or reasons or analysis as to why our plan actually wouldn't work. And we can see that they also didn't respond to the specific points that I brought up under the counter plan. And in debate, silence equals accepted, so they do accept the specific points that I made about how the U.S. pressure in the Philippines has worked before to prompt reform, and also that the military aid actually weakens the resolve of them to reform themselves. Now let's go into the mandate about how we are already doing these fighter jets in the current system. They have 3 responses. Their first response was, I'm not sure if this was actually a serious response, maybe they were just trying to be funny, but they were saying that the naval cruisers crashed. My response is of only one part of the aid. Only one part of the aid. That was only one part of the U.S. military aid to the Philippines. All the other aid is still intact and in one piece. Let's go to their second response. They said that we haven't given the Philippines F-16 fighter jets. But I have 2 responses. My first response is no evidence. No evidence. The Affirmative team brought up no evidence that we haven't given the Philippines any F-16 fighter jets. My second response, though, is that we brought up evidence. The negative team did bring up a piece of evidence saying that we have given the Philippines fighter jets, and that piece of evidence is from August 2012, which I would like to remind you is more recent than the harm evidence that the Affirmative team ran, saying that there was a problem in the status quo of the Philippines. It is also more recent than the evidence that they read under the solvency point, saying that the Philippines needs these fighter jets. The Philippines don't need these fighter jets anymore, since we already gave them to them in August of 2012. Let's move down to their third response about how they're only having discussions about this military aid, and we haven't actually given it to them yet. My response is of the last sentence. That was actually only about the last sentence of the evidence. You can look at the evidence after the round, but pretty much what he was saying is that even discussions about placing more troops in the Philippines is being discussed. So that was about, just according to the structure of the grammar, that was just about the last sentence. It wasn't about the fighter jets or any of the other aids included in that. So what do we have today? What we have is an Affirmative plan that is actually going to cause repercussions and make the human rights abuses worse and not solve the problems of the status quo. But with the negative team's plan, you can solve the problems in the status quo, but also solve for the human rights abuses in the Philippines. The United States needs to stand up to this problem and solve the human rights abuses in the Philippines instead of ignoring it and continuing to fund the Philippines. So I would ask you to vote for the negative team's counterplan in order to solve these problems, in order to stand up to the human rights abuses.
laptop?
Yes, please.
Three minutes remaining.
How much time remaining?
3 minutes.
3? They kind of sound the same. But they both start with the T.
Minutes remaining. A minute 30 left.
All the judges are ready. Negative 2. Okay. In this speech, we're going to be looking at a few things. We're going to be looking at, number 1, why the affirmative team's plan is the best option. Number 2, we're going to be looking at how the perceived problems of the negative team are not real. And we're going to be looking at why the advantage outweighs the current system. Now, looking at the counterplan first. Now, they talked about best policy option, they talked about the real world, and then they talked about the misunderstanding about the mandates. Now, in the last speech, actually, if I will quote from their mandate, their counterplan mandate is conditioned military support. This is not saying F-16s. I asked for the counterplan mandate back in cross-examination. We see there was conditioned military support, not F-16s. That's what they read in their speech. They did not say F-16s. So either one, they blatantly do not solve because this is not a credible, this is not a sufficient, as their piece of evidence mentioned, it needed to be sufficient pressure to solve for these human rights abuses. And what's happening is that either they're ground shifting, either they're changing their mandate from their last speech, or B, they're not solving the problem because the piece of evidence was not specific to their counterplan. We're going to be looking at that, and under this issue alone, you should vote for the affirmative team because the negative team is ground shifting, is changing their ground on this issue, on their mandates. If the affirmative team did this, if the affirmative team changed their mandates in the middle of the round, we would ask you to vote negative. But since it's the negative team who's changed their mandates, that's why I'd ask you to vote affirmative. Looking at the specific counterplan, they looked and said that there were no warrants, there were no points talking about the solvency of the counterplan. And actually, there would have been a lot of points. There would have been extreme contention had the negative team said this first F-16s had said to condition the F-16s in the first speech. So that's my response here: is that the ground shift was because we did not have responses because of the ground shift. Now, looking at the disadvantage, that of detrimental security here. Now, her only response was talking about how we didn't have a source for this. Now, actually, we did provide a source in the lab. We did talk about the terrorist threats in the Philippines, but what happened is he didn't cite a source. It's actually from CNN in 2012 here. Now, looking at the disadvantages, there were a few perceived problems that they talked about. Now, there were Chinese relations, dependence, and that of human rights abuses. Looking actually at all of them together, we see that they're non-unique to the affirmative team's plan, either their ground-shifted plan or their regular plan that they presented in their last speech. All these disadvantages apply to both of these plans that the negative team has presented in their speeches. I'm confused too. Looking at the first disadvantage of Chinese relations. Now, my response to this is that the escalation will lead towards, non-unique to the negative team's plan and the affirmative team's plan as well, that escalation will lead toward, it's whether we'll have a credible deterrence or not. Under an affirmative team's plan, we will have a credible deterrence. Under a negative plan, no, we will not. Looking at the disadvantage of dependence. Now, we need to provide the Philippines with a credible defense. Now, this is what you're getting under an affirmative team's an affirmative ballot, not a negative one here. And the second difference is that under the current system and under the affirmative team's plan, neither things of which the negative team are advocating, we can receive the military aid. Excuse me, the Philippines can receive the military aid. Now, and the military aid thus increasing their security. Looking at this disadvantage of human rights abuses. Now, there was no warrant here why the human rights abuses would be increased. I guess a perceived warrant I had is if Holt used the F-16s to abuse their citizens. I don't think this is not very reasonable here. Looking at the inherency point, talking about how we've already happened and addressing the piece of evidence specifically. Now, the evidence that they brought up in their last speech actually specifically said that the United States has agreed to the Navy vessels, but nothing else. If you look at the evidence at the end of the round, I have it right here. It says specifically it's talking about the naval vessels that crashed onto the reef in my partner's speech. He talked about that, but they have only received that in the military aid, but everything else is under negotiations. Grayson also brought up the fact that my partner talked the piece of evidence from the 1AC saying that the United States has had these, they're under negotiations. It's going to happen in 2012, 2013. What's actually true is that the piece of evidence, you can look at it after the round as well, it said specifically 2016 as my partner referred in cross-examination. Looking at the argument, going back to the counterplan here, we see that this counterplan, this ground-shifting counterplan, should vote for the affirmative team. And looking at the advantage that of increased stability and promoting the stability in the region, as well as promoting the United States interests of the world, we see that this will solve the problem. We see that it'll solve the Chinese problem of the Chinese closing that strait, as well as the negative team not being able to do that. That's why you should vote affirmative in this debate round today. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Can I get our evidence back from the 9C with the naval vessels and the fighter jets?
Sure.
Start with me.
Of course, it's right.
A minute 30 remaining.
Could I also get the counterplan plan text back?
Yeah, of course.
Thanks. All right, that's great. Thank you. All right, judge ready. Okay, the timer. Can we speak this? Yeah. We can abuse human rights all we want, as long as it's in the name of fighting terrorism. That's the affirmative mindset. The only reason the affirmative team claims our counterplan is a bad idea is because it could hurt terrorism, but that philosophy is fundamentally flawed. In this final negative speech, we'll be boiling down the round, looking at the most important issues in my three voting issues. 3 reasons why the negative ballot is justified. Voting issue 1 is that of the minimal harm. The minimal harm. Now, I made several responses to the harm in my PNC. Micah didn't contest any of them. There is no harm in the current system. Literally no threat that China will do anything in the current system. Literally no reason for the affirmative plan. By failing to contest these issues, the affirmative team has really conceded their whole case to us, conceded that there's actually not a reason to do their plan. Let's address under here the issue of whether or not we've already given the Philippines the F-16s. Now, he said it was just the naval vessels. Let me reread the piece of evidence. The Americans have already agreed to transfer 2 naval vessels to an underpowered Philippine Navy and deployment of fighter jets, a coastal radar system, and even increased numbers of American troops on the ground in the Philippines are under discussion. That grammatically, the under discussion part refers to the troops. But if that wasn't enough, the second piece of evidence Michaela read from the lieutenant colonel specifically said that they're already planning to purchase fighter jets from the United States. So even if the first piece of evidence doesn't apply, the second piece of evidence does. With that address, really, there's no reason to vote for the affirmative team at the end of the round because the harm doesn't exist and the plan has literally already happened. But even though the harm doesn't exist, the counterplan is still beneficial because we can still use the counterplan to help improve human rights. Voting issue 2 is that of a proven solution. A proven solution. We'll be addressing the counterplan here. The affirmative team made 3 arguments against the counterplan in the last speech. They first of all said that we ground shifted, that we changed our counterplan in the middle of the round, and that our counterplan was initially to condition all military aid. 3 responses. First, the tag. The tag. Now in debate, the word tag is the technical word we use. It's for the name of the mandate, the name of the harm, a 2 or 3 word summary of what the harm is. Our mandate was condition 8. However, let's look at the details of the mandate, what the plan actually does. That's my second response, the speech. The speech. Michaela specifically in her speech said that our plan conditions their plan on increased human rights. And all the rhetoric we've used throughout this whole debate round, Michaela and I have been talking about how we shouldn't increase aid to the Philippines. We should condition an increase. The current system already has the aid. Only the affirmative plan is supposedly an increase. So grammatically, it really doesn't make sense for us to have ground shifted. But thirdly, the cross-examination. Micah specifically asked Michaela in cross-examination of the 1NC what they conditioned military aid on. She said the increase of the F-16s. So the tag, the speech, and the cross-examination all prove the negative counterplan has stayed true throughout the whole debate round. We condition the affirmative plan on increased human rights. That's exactly what the counterplan does. That's why it's beneficial. Secondly, under the terrorism disadvantage, Michael referenced a report from CNN in 2012. One, he didn't read the evidence. He just said there is a source that says something. But he didn't read the evidence. That's obviously not enough in the debate round. But secondly, that it's a bad mindset. Again, the affirmative team is saying that human rights don't matter as long as we fight terrorism. That's a bad mindset to have. Thirdly, he said that they would have brought a bunch of arguments against our counterplan if we hadn't changed it. 2 responses. First of all, same strategy. Both the counterplan and the counterplan that they thought we were running both conditioned military aid. It's just what kind of military aid we conditioned. So every argument about how conditioning military aid is bad, they still could have run, and it still would have, well, it wouldn't have applied because it wouldn't be true. But they still could have run, and we would have contested it. So really we see that the counterplan empirically is proven. Historically, pressure on the Philippines worked. The affirmative team has no examples of counterexamples of the counterplan working. The affirmative team conceded the solvency of the counterplan, that the counterplan, the negative ballot, improves human rights. Let's go to voting issue 3, that of a counterproductive policy. This is the affirmative plan, a counterproductive policy. He said that all the disadvantages are non-unique. First of all, on the we're going to address this one by one. On the Chinese relations, he said that war happens under both ballots. Well, if that's true, all that means is that if you vote affirmative or negative, war happens. But if you vote negative, we stand up for U.S. values by conditioning our military aid on improved human rights. On disadvantage 2, he said that increased dependency, said that they need defense and that it was non-unique and that it applied to both plans. However, the rhetoric I used was of unconditional support. In order for the Philippines to be dependent on the United States, in order for them to get our support, they should have to stand up to U.S. values. I specifically said that their plan sets a precedent that the Philippines and other countries can get U.S. support without conforming to our values. That's the rhetoric I used, so it is unique to the affirmative plan. Thirdly, of the human rights abuses, you said there's no warrant. That simply isn't true. Michaela and her 1NC read a piece of evidence that giving the Philippines military aid without conditions weakens their resolve. Weakens their resolve to fight human rights abuses. At the end of the round, what do we have? We have the affirmative plan that has already happened, that addresses a harm that doesn't exist, and is counterproductive policy. Under the negative ballot, we improve human rights. We make sure the United States and Philippines are actually countries that can work together. At the end of the round, the negative plan is proven historically, improves human rights, and is the better option in the debate round. Thank you so much.
Can we look at the mandates again?
Yes.
And the already happened evidence.
Yes. There's the 2 that I got right.
35 seconds.
1:15. Okay.
Seconds left.
10.
10.
Let's get this over with. Everyone's ready? Okay, good. And now everyone's ready? Don't let the negative team be silly. It's what I said in my first speech. It's what I'll say in this speech. Don't let the negative team be silly. Don't let them change their counter plan. Don't let them change their mind from throughout everything they said in their first speech. So we'll address their voting issues. But at the end of today's debate, we'll see how the counter plans are extremely similar and how an affirmative ballot is an affirmative ballot because we're the affirmative team. We'd ask you to vote for the affirmative team because of that. Let's address their first voting issue. They said that there's no harm. They stated that my partner dropped basically all of Grayson's responses. However, let's look at what one fact has been not addressed by the negative team throughout today's entire debate round, is that we give the Philippines a credible defense. My partner brought up this in the first speech with multiple pieces of evidence, saying if you enact the plan of the affirmative team, we'll be able to sufficiently protect the Philippines from any Chinese intervention, from any Chinese aggression that would occur. Vote for the affirmative team to protect the nation of the Philippines from China and from any external threats facing their country. Their second argument is that we're already giving them things, we're planning to get things. First piece of evidence that talked about the Navy ships, I urge you to look at it at the end of today's debate round because it's obviously an important argument in today's debate round. It's back there because I forgot it. Whoops. But the piece of evidence says the naval ships, comma, which Grayson was taking the comma out, the naval ships, comma, and XYZ, including the F-16s, and then it said, and even. So just look at the evidence, it's hard to explain. Look at the evidence, the F-16s haven't been given, they're still being negotiated. Their second piece of evidence stating from the Army officials saying we're already giving them planes, nowhere did it include F-16s. F-16s are the only thing that can provide a credible defense to the Philippines. Again, please look at the piece of evidence after the round, because it says what the affirmative team says it's saying. Their second argument was that there's a proven solution. And they said, Michaela said in the tag, the speech, and the cross-examination that the counterplan only dealt with the planes. Well, I thought Grayson's subpoints were interesting because they were going to be the exact same subpoints in my speech, so I'll keep those subpoints. The tag. Yes, the tag says what the affirmative team says it was going to say. The tag says they do cut military aid, only dealing with military aid. The negative team didn't respond to the argument that our case is different than military aid. Functionally, the negative team's counterplan is a second mandate or a second policy that the affirmative team can do because they haven't proven they can both be done if you look at their tag. Second, if you look to their speech. Nowhere in their speech, nowhere in Michaela's speech did she say the words F-16s. We only condition on the F-16s. Nowhere in her speech did she say F-16s. Nowhere in the rest of her speech, basically her analysis under the tag. My third answer is with the cross-examination. When Micah asked her what military aid they cut, she said, we cut military assistance. Both teams agree that the counterplans are different and that the counterplans can both happen. The only negative team argument they have is that they only address the planes. If we look to Michaela's speech, then they address all of military aid, not just the planes. What does this mean? This means that if basically what this entire round comes down to is that entire first speech. Because if you believe that if you believe that the negative team's counterplan deals with all United States aid to the Philippines, that can happen under an affirmative ballot as well. Both teams can have, or for both teams that can happen. Only with the affirmative team, though, can you get the mandate of having the planes be a credible deterrent for the nation of the Philippines. We would ask you to vote to help deter the threat because both teams are both plans are two different policies. Their third voting issue was it's a counterproductive policy. His first argument was that a war with China is non-unique, and basically that they need to take a stand for human rights. My first argument is they don't take a stand for human rights because their counterplan is the exact same thing as the affirmative team's plan because both can be done. Since both can be done, then they can both be done, but basically they can both only be done if you vote for the affirmative team. It's kind of complicated, but it's true. Their second argument was that, well, if there's going to be war either way, oh well. Only the affirmative team protects the country of the Philippines from war. So if you vote for the negative team and there is war, they agreed there will be war if you vote for the negative team. If you vote for the negative team, there will be war and China will overrun the Philippines. If you vote for the affirmative team, there will be war, and the Philippines will have a credible defense against the threat of China. Their second disadvantage was that we increased dependence. Providing the Philippines with a credible deterrent, credible defense, is not making them need everything from the United States. We've looked at throughout this speech and throughout this round how the Philippines needs a credible defense because they've been spending so much money domestically. They haven't been spending money for national defense. We need to increase the credible defense of the country, of the Philippines, and that applies to their third disadvantage. Their second and third disadvantages don't apply because we give to the Philippines a credible defense, so they continue to do what they have been doing. So my simple voting issue is of security and stability. By providing the Philippines with a credible deterrent against the country of China, we provide them with security and stability. Since the negative team's counterplan is essentially a second mandate of the affirmative team, and both plans are basically the same, function for the same purpose, and both can be done at the same time, we would ask you to stand with us for the affirmative team and push our policy today through Congress. Thank you very much.
Thanks for judging.
Thank you so much for judging.
Judging.
Thanks for judging that. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for judging.
Thank you so much for